Long ago, there were whispers of a race called humans. They were said to be fearless, restless, always pushing into the unknown. But on the alien world of Valkara, such stories became nothing more than bedtime tales. Children laughed at them. Teachers spoke of humans the way people speak of ghosts. Creatures that once walked but now belonged only to dust. For generations, no one had seen a human ship. No one had heard a human voice. The galaxy decided they were gone forever, forgotten. The aliens of Valkara grew proud of themselves. They built tall glass towers that touched the skies and filled their streets with colors of wealth. They thought their empire would last 1,000 lifetimes. When someone mentioned the name human, it was always with a smile of arrogance. Weak creatures, they said, always fighting, never surviving. To them, humanity was a failed experiment. They erased the stories from their libraries, claiming their own ancestors must have exaggerated when they spoke of the fierce men and women of Earth. But not everyone believed the lies. In quiet corners of old archives, dusty scrolls and cracked crystal tablets still carried echoes of human history. One archivist, an old alien with trembling hands, sometimes stayed awake late at night to read those forgotten words. He read of battles where humans stood against impossible odds. He read of inventions created with desperate brilliance. He read of a promise carved into the final transmissions: "We will return." The old archivist's chest tightened each time he whispered those words to himself. He did not dare say them aloud in public. On Valkara, anyone who spoke of humans as more than a joke was mocked or silenced. The young people of Valkara knew nothing of fear. They walked freely in the markets, singing songs of their power. They believed the galaxy belonged only to them. But deep under the surface of their planet, the ground sometimes rumbled. Tiny quakes would shake the lights in their homes, knock over vases, disturb their sleep. The leaders said it was natural, the planet's heart shifting, as it always did. The citizens believed it. Why question anything when life was so easy? Still, there were whispers. Some claimed the tremors came from the stars, not the ground. Some said they had seen strange flickers of light far out in space, patterns that were not random. The council dismissed these voices. "Do not speak of old fears," they said. "Humans are dust. The galaxy belongs to us." The more they repeated it, the more they seemed to convince themselves. The archivist, however, could not sleep. He would stare at the ancient records glowing faintly in the darkness. He saw the faces of humans captured long ago, eyes burning with stubborn fire. Something inside him told him the galaxy had made a mistake. You cannot erase a race like that so easily. He remembered one line clearly from a damaged record: "Humans do not vanish. They endure." Everywhere else, life on Valkara moved without care. Children played under the golden domes, never imagining danger. Scholars wrote great books about the superiority of their species. Merchants filled their ships with treasures from other worlds. No one feared attack. No one prepared for war. Why would they? The galaxy was theirs, and the only rivals worth remembering were long dead. Yet in quiet moments when the stars shone without clouds, some of the oldest aliens swore they could feel eyes watching them. They did not speak of it. Pride held their tongues. To admit fear was to admit weakness, and Valkara would never do that. They believed they were alone in the galaxy, masters of everything they touched. And so the myth of humans faded even more. Songs of them were turned into jokes. Old records were buried deeper into archives. Children grew up never knowing the word Earth. The very memory of humanity was falling apart. But promises have a way of echoing across time. In the silent spaces between stars, something stirred, something remembered. The archivist pressed his wrinkled hand against the screen of an old transmission one last time before locking it away. The voice of a long-dead human soldier whispered through the static: "If you think we are gone, you are wrong. If you think we are broken, you are blind. We will return." The archivist shivered. He could not explain why, but his heart told him the galaxy was not ready for the day when that promise came true. Valkara believed humans were forgotten. They believed their world was safe, untouched by history. But beneath their confidence, beneath their arrogance, the first tremors of change had already begun to shake the ground. Something was moving closer, something their songs and laughter could not protect them from. The forgotten race was not gone. They were only waiting, and when they returned, the galaxy would remember. The quakes grew stronger with each passing season. At first, they were small, a gentle shake that rattled glasses in kitchens and made the lights flicker for a heartbeat. People laughed it off, saying the planet was stretching its bones. But soon, whole buildings began to sway. Markets shook as goods fell from stalls, and families rushed outside, afraid their homes would collapse. The council called for calm, telling everyone it was a normal shift of the planet's crust. Yet deep inside, many felt unease they could not name. One night, the tremor lasted almost a full minute. Towers leaned, statues cracked, and the ground split open in some districts. From the cracks came a sound, low, metallic, unnatural. It did not feel like the voice of a planet. It felt like something hidden, waiting, and now stirring awake. Scientists recorded the vibrations and found strange patterns within them. The data did not match earthquakes, it matched signals. Someone or something was knocking at Velkara's core. The council refused to release the findings, but whispers spread quickly. Some claimed the quakes were messages, codes repeating again and again in rhythms too precise for nature. Others said it was the anger of gods, punishing Velkara for its arrogance. But in the taverns where old pilots gathered, there was one rumor that made the blood run cold. It's them, the humans. Most laughed at that, shaking their heads, yet the thought refused to die. Too many remembered faint stories from their grandparents, voices trembling as they described human eyes, fierce, stubborn, and impossible to forget. For those who carried fragments of memory, the tremors felt like footsteps, heavy and getting closer. Meanwhile, the archivist spent long nights bent over the ancient records. He discovered that some of the old human transmissions had spoken of hiding, of burrowing deep into unknown stars, of becoming shadows until the time to rise again. The archivist's heart pounded as he compared the old signals with the patterns of the current tremors. They were nearly identical. It was as if humanity's voice, long buried, was now echoing from the very bones of Velkara's world. In the streets, life pretended to continue. Children still played, merchants still haggled, and soldiers still paraded. But in their eyes was a new sharpness, a new doubt. Every time the ground shook beneath their feet, they felt a chill run through their bodies. They began to look to the sky more often, waiting for something to appear. They did not know what shape it would take, but they felt it was close. The council called emergency gatherings, their voices full of denial, but their hands trembling. They spoke louder than ever before about Velkara's strength, but their words sounded thin against the silence that followed each quake. In private chambers, some leaders asked questions they would never admit in public. What if humans were not gone? What if the myths were true? What if this was not the end of Velkara's safety, but the beginning of something they could not control? The archivist knew he could not stay silent anymore. He copied the old transmissions onto small data chips and handed them secretly to students, travelers, and anyone willing to listen. Some mocked him, others ignored him, but a few felt the weight of the words. "We will return," the human voice said again through the static. "When you forget us, we will remind you." Velkara's world was not silent anymore. The tremors became part of every day, a second heartbeat pulsing under the soil. People began to dream of shadows moving in the skies. Children woke at night, claiming they heard footsteps outside, though the streets were empty. The air itself felt heavy, as if waiting for a storm no one could see. And then one evening, the sky flickered. Not lightning, not storm, but a glow from beyond the clouds. The people looked up, shielding their eyes, and for the first time in centuries, they felt something they had forgotten how to feel: fear. The archivist stood in the great hall of records, his hands shaking as he pressed the final crystal into the reader. For weeks, he had been chasing fragments, pieces of transmissions so old they crumbled like dust when touched. But that night, the fragments aligned. A broken human voice filled the chamber, rough with static but clear enough to cut through centuries. "If you hear this, we are not finished. We will not be erased. We will return." The words echoed across the empty hall, and the archivist felt his throat tighten. He had read the myths 1,000 times, but to hear a human voice, not an alien historian's record, not a council's edited version, but an actual human, was different. It was alive. It carried a weight no council decree could bury. He leaned on his staff, breath shallow, as though the dead themselves had spoken in his ear. The next morning, he carried the data to the council. He begged them to listen, to at least consider that the tremors were more than nature, that perhaps the humans had endured. The chamber filled with polite laughter. One counselor waved his hand and called the recording a trick of broken frequencies. Another sneered and accused the archivist of clinging to fairy tales. Humans are gone, the leader said firmly. Their bones are dust. Their world is ash. What you hear is nothing but noise. But noise did not shake the floor beneath their feet. As the council argued, another tremor rippled through the marble chamber. Dust fell from the high ceiling, and the great glass windows shivered. For a moment, even the proudest counselor froze, their faces pale. Yet they quickly buried the fear beneath arrogance, declaring the matter closed. The archivist left the chamber with his head low, but his heart burned with a truth he could not ignore. In the streets, the whispers grew louder. People passed copies of the archivist's recordings in secret, listening in shadowed corners. The human voice struck something inside them they did not understand. It felt older than fear, older than pride. It felt like a reminder that Velkara was not alone, that the galaxy was not theirs to own. Children repeated the words as if they were rhymes. We will return, not realizing they were chanting the promise of a forgotten race. The military tried to calm the panic by staging parades. Soldiers in polished armor marched through the avenues, banners flying high. They told the people Velkara was safe, that no human ghost could touch them. But even the soldiers felt unease. When they stood at night on the watchtowers staring into the sky, they sometimes thought they saw faint lights flickering where no stars should be. The archivist spent his nights in the records, searching deeper. He found reports of the last human ships seen centuries ago, vessels fleeing into regions of space so hostile that no alien dared follow. Yet those records ended with silence, not proof of destruction. It struck him like a blade of truth. Silence was not death, silence was preparation. If humans had disappeared into the void, perhaps it was not to die, but to sharpen themselves in darkness. Every new quake confirmed his fear. The rhythm was too exact, like a pulse, like a countdown. And as Velkara's cities trembled and the people looked nervously at the heavens, the archivist realized the council was blind, but the world itself remembered. The home world was shaking, not just from within, but from without, as if answering a voice returning from the void. The voice he had heard was not the past. It was a warning. It was a promise. And now, after centuries of silence, that promise was coming due. The night the sky broke open, the people of Velkara gathered in the streets, staring upward in disbelief. At first, it looked like a star, bright and steady, but then it grew larger, closer, until the clouds themselves split apart under its glow. The air vibrated with a deep hum, a sound that rattled bones and shook glass towers. Children screamed, elders dropped to their knees, and soldiers raised their weapons toward the heavens, though their hands trembled. The object that descended was no natural body. It was a ship, enormous and scarred, its surface covered with marks of battles long past. Unlike the sleek silver curves of Velkara's fleets, this vessel was dark, angular, built for survival rather than beauty. Its shadow stretched across the capital as it settled in orbit, and every device on the planet flickered to life without command. Screens, tablets, even broken radios crackled with static as a signal forced its way through. The fleet of Velkara scrambled into the sky, hundreds of ships rising like a swarm of insects around the intruder. They opened channels, demanding identification, demanding explanation, but no response came. Instead, the giant vessel turned slowly, deliberately, and the symbol etched on its side caught the light of the sun. A circle, a blue and green swirl painted long ago, half faded yet unmistakable. The human emblem. Gasps swept through the planet like wildfire. The myths had stepped out of shadow and into the sky. The council shouted denials, swearing it was impossible, a trick, an enemy using old symbols to frighten them. But their voices were drowned by the quake that followed, stronger than any before. Buildings split, roads cracked, and dust rose like smoke. It felt as though the ship above was pressing its weight into the very core of Velkara. The fleets, in their panic, fired. Hundreds of bright lances of energy streaked upward, striking the massive hull. But the blasts fizzled harmlessly against its shields like sparks against stone. The people below watched in horror as the human ship answered. Not with weapons at first, but with silence. a silence so deep it seemed to swallow every sound on the planet. Then, as though the galaxy itself held its breath, the ship's engines roared, and the ground shuddered under a force too vast to comprehend. A single strike followed, a beam of light brighter than the sun. It did not hit the city, but the empty sea beyond. Yet when the light touched water, the ocean boiled into steam, and waves as tall as towers rose and crashed against the coast. Entire districts flooded within minutes. The people screamed, not just in fear of death, but in the realization of truth. Humanity had returned, and their power was no myth. In that moment, all the laughter, all the mocking words about humans being weak vanished from the memory of Valkara. The forgotten race was no longer forgotten. They were above them, watching, reminding every living soul of the promise their ancestors had buried. The ground continued to shake, as though the world itself was bowing to the presence of the ship. No one knew what would happen next, but every heart on Valkara understood one thing. The age of arrogance was over. The humans had come back, and nothing would ever be the same again. Every screen across Valkara went black for a breathless moment before a voice poured through, deep and steady, carrying the weight of centuries. It was not the harsh tone of a conqueror, nor the trembling plea of a survivor. It was calm, measured, and filled with certainty. You thought us forgotten, but humanity endures. The words echoed in every home, every ship, every chamber of power. Even those hiding in the ruins of collapsed buildings froze, the sound pressing against their chests like a living force. The voice spoke again, clearer now, its cadence deliberate. We are not ghosts. We are not myths. We are not weak. We remember, even when you tried to forget. We walked through fire, through silence, through the edge of extinction. And still, we remain. Families clutched each other tightly as if the very syllables could tear open the sky. Soldiers lowered their weapons without realizing it, their armor suddenly heavy, their pride suddenly hollow. For the first time in living memory, Valkara's leaders had no words. The council chambers, always filled with argument and performance, were silent. The counselors stared at one another as if waiting for someone to explain the impossible. But nothing could explain it. The human voice was undeniable. Not a forgery, not a trick. It was real, alive, unyielding. In the outer districts, young aliens who had grown up mocking the tales of humans found themselves shaking uncontrollably. The myths their grandparents had whispered now felt like warnings, and the words of the voice pierced straight into their hearts. Some wept, though they did not understand why. Others simply stared at the sky, unable to look away from the vast shadow of the ship. The archivist stood in the rubble of the old record hall, tears running down his wrinkled face. For decades, he had been called a fool, a dreamer, a madman for believing in the old transmissions. Now the very proof thundered across the world, drowning every voice of denial. He pressed his hand over his chest as the human voice declared, "We do not return to be worshipped. We do not return to kneel. We return because we endure, and the galaxy will remember us." The words did not threaten, yet they struck harder than any weapon. Valkara's people felt small, suddenly stripped of the arrogance that had wrapped them for centuries. The ship above remained still, not firing, not attacking, simply watching as the weight of its presence crushed their pride. The silence after the final line was unbearable. Every alien ear strained for more, desperate and terrified of what might follow. The voice had spoken, and in its calmness lay something more terrifying than open rage. It was not a warning. It was a reminder. Humanity was alive. Humanity had survived, and now every world that had forgotten them would be forced to remember. Panic seized the fleets orbiting Valkara as commanders barked orders through broken comms. Desperation fueled their attacks, bright streaks of plasma and ion fire painting the skies, but every blast simply vanished against the human ship's shields. The great vessel drifted forward, unhurried, like a predator that knew resistance was meaningless. Its hull bore scars of wars older than Valkara's current empire, each mark a story of survival carved in steel. Then, the silence ended. A hum rolled out, deep and sharp, rattling through the bones of every living creature below. Before anyone could react, a single beam of light cut across the stars, slicing through the alien armada. Entire squadrons blinked out in an instant, their ships reduced to fragments of fire. The shockwave rippled down into the atmosphere, cracking the planet's crust and sending fountains of molten rock bursting from the ground. Cities far from the capital trembled as if giants walked beneath their foundations. Velkara's proudest generals shouted defiance, but fear cracked their voices. They hurled every weapon they had, missiles, disruptors, energy cannons, but the human ship seemed untouchable, as if wrapped in the very will of survival itself. When it struck again, another third of their fleet disappeared, not with an explosion, but with silence. The ships erased from existence as though the void itself had swallowed them whole. On the surface, people screamed as towers collapsed and streets opened into yawning chasms. Families ran, stumbling through smoke and falling debris. For centuries, they had believed no power could challenge them, but now the very sky betrayed that illusion. Parents pulled children close, whispering old stories they once mocked, now prayers against the unstoppable storm above. Amid the chaos, the archivist stood in the ruins, his eyes reflecting the fiery sky. Where others saw terror, he saw proof. The humans were not destroyers for the sake of destruction. Their strikes were measured, deliberate. They did not aim at cities unless forced. They struck only the fleets, the symbols of Velkara's pride, stripping them down piece by piece until their arrogance lay bare. It was not just war, it was judgment. The ground shook again as if answering the voice that had spoken earlier. Dust rose like smoke across the world, and the people finally understood what their leaders had denied. This was not an enemy from nowhere. This was not a ghost. This was the return of those they had chosen to forget. Humanity had survived exile, outlived silence, and returned with power so vast it bent the very laws of war. The screams of battle faded under the roar of collapsing fleets. Velkara was no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting to survive a reminder written in fire across their skies. The cities lay in ruins, smoke rising from broken towers and streets split open like scars across the land. Survivors huddled in shattered homes, their once proud songs replaced with silence. Whispers moved through the rubble faster than fire, whispers of the voice of the ship, of the truth that could no longer be buried. The young asked their parents if the stories were real, and the parents, for the first time, could not lie. They had mocked the past, but now they trembled, knowing the past had returned to stand above them. In the ruins of the great library, the archivist gathered the few who still listened. He held up a cracked crystal, the same one that carried the human promise, and the faint words played again, "We will return." The survivors stared with wide eyes, their fear mixing with awe. For so long, they had believed themselves masters of the galaxy. Yet here, in the dust and ashes, they realized they had always been children compared to the race they thought extinct. Old memories resurfaced among the elders, fragments of their grandparents' tales, humans who fought without surrender, who adapted faster than any species, who endured storms that should have broken them. Those fragments, once laughed at, now returned with the weight of undeniable truth. The myths were not just stories, they were warnings that Velkara had chosen to forget. Families lit small fires in the darkness, not for warmth, but to keep fear at bay. Around those flames, they spoke softly of the humans, their voices no longer mocking, but reverent. Even the soldiers, stripped of their pride, sat among civilians, their armor cracked and weapons useless. They remembered the way the human voice had spoken, not with cruelty, not with rage, with certainty. It was that calmness that haunted them most. The archivist, with tears cutting lines through the dust on his face, whispered to those around him, "They are not gone. They never were. And now the galaxy will remember." His words carried through the ruins, repeated from mouth to mouth until they spread across the battered world. Above them, the ship still waited, unmoving, its shadow stretching like a reminder carved into the sky. It did not fire again, yet its silence spoke louder than any bombardment. The people of Velkara understood the message. They had laughed at humanity, erased their memory, declared them weak and broken. But now they saw the truth with their own eyes. Humanity was stronger than time, stronger than exile, stronger than arrogance. In the ashes of their pride, the memory of humans was restored, not as myth, not as a forgotten race, but as a force the galaxy could never again dismiss. When dawn broke over Velkara, the ship still hovered in silence, its shadow stretching across the horizon like a second sun. No fleets rose to meet it anymore. The once mighty armada lay in fragments, scattered across the upper atmosphere, burning as streaks of falling fire. On the surface, the people emerged slowly from ruins, blinking against the pale light, their world forever changed. Where arrogance had stood, only fear and awe remained. Then, without warning, the ship's lights flared once more, and a final transmission carried across every channel. We did not come to conquer. We did not come to kneel. We came to remind you. Humanity endures. The words struck deeper than any weapon. They were not a threat, but a truth, undeniable and unshakable. The silence that followed felt heavier than the tremors had ever been. Velkara's leaders stood powerless, their voices gone, their authority shattered in a single night. Slowly, the human ship turned, its engines glowing like a rising storm. With deliberate calm, it pulled away from the planet, ascending into the void. It left no occupation, no chains, no banners planted in victory. It left only memory, and memory was enough. The people of Velkara watched as it vanished into the stars, carrying with it the echo of a race they had buried under dust and lies. Across the planet, survivors whispered the words they had once mocked. They spoke them not with laughter, but with trembling respect. Children repeated them as if they were sacred, and elders bowed their heads, realizing the galaxy had never truly belonged to Velkara. The myths were true. The humans had returned, and their return was not conquest, it was warning. The archivist, standing among the ruins of the great library, felt a strange peace settle over him. All his life he had been told he was a fool, clinging to broken records and forgotten promises. Now he knew the truth had not been his alone. Humanity had carried it across centuries, and with their return, they had forced the galaxy to remember. Velkara would rebuild, but it would never be the same. Its songs, its pride, its very history had been rewritten overnight. Every alien world beyond its skies would soon hear of what happened, and every leader would feel the same cold tremor of fear. The forgotten race had shown themselves, not as weak, not as extinct, but as unyielding survivors. As the stars swallowed the last glimmer of the ship, one truth remained carved into the hearts of all who had seen it. Humanity was not gone. Humanity had never been gone. And now the galaxy would never dare to forget them again.